I'm honored to share some insights today regarding some Shiva practices that might be considered perhaps innovative or a renewal of Jewish spiritual practice, and how doulas might be able to better support grieving families who choose to embrace Shiva as a Jewish mourning practice. Let me begin by saying that many years ago, when I first began facilitating Shiva gatherings, I found it very frustrating. It's such a potentially powerful and meaningful ritual, and I never felt that I was facilitating in a way that adequately harnessed its potential. I tried a variety of different things, but was never quite satisfied with the results. Everything changed when my own mother died in 1989. My mother lived in Cleveland, Ohio, where me and my three siblings were born and raised. We all lived in different cities around the country at the time. My mother had sold the house we grew up in and moved to a local Jewish senior living center. She was quite content there until she suffered a major stroke. Thankfully, my brother David, who was doing a fellowship in neuroradiology at Northwestern University, was able to get our mother into their stroke rehab program, which at the time was one of the finest in the country. My siblings and I traded off taking my mother into our homes to help her heal for many months following her stint at rehab. It was a sign of the quality of her recovery that she insisted on wanting to return to Cleveland to her apartment unit in the senior living center and to her friends and community. She lived a very happy life for the last years before she died. We all gathered in Cleveland for her funeral and burial. The apartment in the senior living center was way too small for any Shiva gathering. We were all staying at a residential suite hotel, and since we booked a good number of rooms for a week for all of the out-of-town people, the hotel was kind enough to make a large conference room available to us for the entire week. A conference room is not the ideal place for a Shiva, but we arranged it as comfortably as possible and coordinated with the hotel to bring in food for our meals. We let our extended family and all of my mother's friends know that we would be sitting Shiva at the hotel. The evening after my mother's funeral, there was a good-sized gathering at the hotel, and people brought over additional food as well. The next morning, we all awakened and gathered in the conference room, not knowing what was going to happen. We figured that if it was just us, my siblings, our spouses, and children, Dayenu, it would be enough. We decided that we would use this time of Shiva to deeply engage the Jewish concept of Zichrona Livracha, may her memory be a blessing. I've always understood that this was more than just a saying, but rather as a spiritual directive to remember a loved one by consciously engaging in drawing out our memories of our loved ones and embracing each as a blessing. We began what I now understand as a time of sacred storytelling, filled with songs my mother loved, a sharing of a rich compendium of stories, memories, and special moments that came to us during this focused sacred time. Throughout the day, people drifted into the Shiva space, friends of my mother, our friends, and others who just wanted to pay their respects. They entered the growing circle and shared their own stories, sometimes stories we had heard or even experiences we had been present for, and it was so wonderful to hear and witness their perspectives. There was so much laughter and a sweet sea of tears. We sang and played music my mother loved and really called her into the space. After dinner, the gathering swelled each night. At some point, every evening, we paused and intoned the Kadisha tome, the mourner's Kaddish, to honor her memory. We did not do the evening service because that wasn't a part of what we normally did. And in fact, the purpose of doing a Mariv, an evening service at Shiva, is to give the mourners an opportunity to say the mourner's Kaddish with at least a quorum of people present for adequate support for the mourners. So we simply paused in our deeply comforting grief work every evening to say the Kaddish. That was a week my family will never forget. It really felt like a profound act of kibud aim, honoring our mother in the deepest way by setting aside this cycle of creation to fully inhabit our grief process. In the aftermath of this Shiva for my mother, I reflected on what I could learn from it as a rabbi and a facilitator of future Shiva gatherings. I knew that most folks in my own community were not going to sit Shiva for 7 days. Well, I certainly shared the richness of this experience with my community. I understood that a vast majority of the people in the community were still going to opt for one night of Shiva or maybe 3 nights of Shiva if they chose to do Shiva at all. So whenever there was a death in the community, I would talk to the family about their options of being fully with their loss directly following the death. I understood the value of a brief evening service to energetically help people who were attending the Shiva to make the transition from their often busy day into the sacred space of Shiva. I also let people know that that was not a requirement and we could always include the Kaddish at some point. I also discovered that if we concluded the brief evening service, no matter what suggestions or directions I offered the gathering, as soon as the service ended, people reverted back to small talk and chit chat, often over the food that was brought to provide for those in mourning. There just didn't seem to be a way to keep people in that space of remembering once the service was over. As a result, I decided not to end the service, but to extend it and invite family members and close friends to share stories about the person who died as a part of the service. We played their favorite music. We invited others to share any of their memories as well. When I felt like the stories that needed to be told were shared, I would conclude the service. And I think that this approach works pretty well for mourners. The biggest obstacles in inviting people to access Shiva as a meaningful time of remembering a close relative directly following their death are the following. One, people are often unfamiliar with the tradition of Shiva themselves and feel like they don't know what to do, so they opt out. Two, they're often concerned that many of their friends are also unfamiliar with Shiva and will not come. Three, often the person who died is a relative who lived in another city, so the mourners attend the funeral in that city and often feel like when they return home, there aren't enough people who knew the person who died, so what's the point? And finally, why should people come to a Shiva for someone they may not have ever met or did not really know? The best way to help people who are unfamiliar with Shiva as a tradition is to let them know that they are deserving of support. By talking to them about the need to allow friends and community to support them at a time of Shiva reminds them in a powerful way that they are not alone in their grief. I also provide an email that briefly explains what Shiva is about that they can send out to their friends in their community. Obviously, if they're in a synagogue community, the synagogue will take care of this for them usually. For the people who travel to another city for a funeral of a close family member, it often feels like the death, the funeral, the initial grief experience happened somewhere else and is disconnected to their life back home. This is true and often makes it all the more essential to share their loss with their own local friends and community in order to ground their grief in their real lives. I think it's important to remind the people who are grieving that the Shiva gathering is for them in their process of mourning. It doesn't matter if the friends in the community who gather with them knew the person who died or not. This is so that they can ground their grieving process in their real lives, in their real community, whether anyone in the community knew the deceased or not. In fact, once people have attended a meaningful Shiva gathering for a friend or community member, they are far more likely to be open to accessing the spiritual practice of Shiva when they need it themselves. So I want to say that the most important innovation for Shiva gatherings is to maintain focus on why we are gathering and not let the energy disperse and simply become a social gathering. Now, this is not easy, and this takes some planning and dedication to honor the grief process. We can invite people who knew the deceased to bring an object that reminds them of the person who died to place on an altar in the center of the Shiva room, and if they're willing, to share a few words or a story about the object they brought. Anything we can do to call in the spirit of the person who has died can contribute to a more meaningful Shiva. As I've mentioned, one of the ways of doing this is to play music that was meaningful to the person who died. I want to cite an example that probably will seem a bit, outside the pale, but I had a friend who did a Shiva outside around a sacred fire that was kindled in honor of the person who died. People were warned and dressed appropriately, and the fire at the center kept everyone focused and present in a very different way. I know this is not for everyone, but it illustrates creative ways that we can construct a sacred setting that invites people gathered to stay in spiritual practice. Because to be a witness in a Shiva gathering, even if the witness never met the person who died, can be a spiritually alive experience, both for the witness and for the people who are actively grieving. So these are just a few thoughts. I wanted to invite Zoe to add something from a doula perspective right now.
Hi everyone. I'm sure a lot of you have attended Shivas for some of your clients. So I wanted to share one story of a Shiva gathering that I attended in the role of doula, and it was just sort of poignant because, I got there and there were so many people in the room. I mean, the room was filled to bursting, maybe 40 people in a small room. Dan was sort of leading the Shiva, and after the prayers and after the man's son spoke and shared some childhood memories of his father, stories, Dan asked the people in the room, does anybody else have anything to say about this man who just died? And it was silent. No, I think a few of them did know him, but they were shy or they didn't know what to say, and other people hadn't known him at all, and there was just silence. And partly because he had been in assisted living for a few years, and not many people had seen him. He had dementia. But I had been visiting this man every week for over a year, and spending time with him and talking to him and doing art and music and listening to his stories. And I had so much to share. And so I asked permission if I could share some of what I had experienced of this man in his final year of life. And the family said yes. And so I was able to tell some stories that were really significant about his dying process and his final year of life, and how he painted images of boats and ships, and how he and I talked about that he was about to go on a sailing trip that was very meaningful to him, and how, and he painted this boat and he talked about this trip, um, and I think, I believe that it gave comfort and support to the family, and also informed the gathering about a little bit, maybe about the dying process and what it had been like for this particular man, and some of the humor and the beauty around what came out of our sessions. So that's just one example, I think, of how a doula could contribute something. I know not all doulas spend that much time with their clients, but I was lucky to have that time with him.
Thank you. But to have someone who, to honor the dying process and honor the relationship that doulas have can be a really warm and wonderful contribution to the Shiva. I wonder if there are any questions anyone has about Shiva, about the clarifications, anything you want to share about maybe experiences that relate to this topic.
Yeah, thank you for your beautiful teaching, Dan and Zoe. I just want to echo what you were saying about the importance of having a Shiva minion where you live, especially if the funeral takes place somewhere far away. And I remember about a decade ago attending a Shiva at a friend's house, and his father had died in Colorado. I'm in California, and he read the eulogy that he had read at the funeral. And this was like before Zoom funerals, you could zoom in and stuff. And hearing him read the eulogy, I learned so much about his father. And it was such a way for him to bring his father into his home community. I still remember it so vividly. And so I have encouraged people to do that since. I find one of the challenges, more so with friends than necessarily with clients, is that I ask them, do you want to have a Shiva minion when you get home? And they say, let me think about it, maybe like in a week or a couple weeks. And then they let it go. So it's like a hard thing that you want them to do it within those early days of arriving home, but you also can't impose it on them. And they think, oh, I'll do it, but they put it off. That's been kind of my experience when I've tried with friends to encourage them to do it at home, that they think, I'll maybe in a week or two, and then they don't do it.
One of the incentives that I have leaned into that I found works is, people are on the fence, again, should we, I don't know if we want to do a Shiva, or we did a Shiva back in Boston or New York. And I say to them, you have a lot of friends, you have a community, and people are going to want to talk to you and express their condolences. And you're going to have to repeat your story over and over and over again. If you have a Shiva gathering locally, everyone can hear this story and share it as a community or as a group of friends. And that might save you a lot of need for repetition. And it sounds kind of unimportant, but it seems to me a lot of people hear the wisdom of that and decide to have at least one night of Shiva because of that. So whatever works.
Thank you for this. And I just wanted to add, actually, I went to a Shiva last night. It was a synagogue community friend. His sister had died in St. Louis. I live in Manhattan. And it was exactly what you described. He told her story, he shared photographs, and none of us knew her. Um, and you could see how much it gave him by being able to share this. He hadn't been able to go because of physical illness, but he had read his eulogy over the phone that got shared at the funeral, and then he shared it with us and a lot else. And the spirit of his sister was so beautiful, came through. And it was really, it's exactly what you were describing. And I think I've been to more funerals where I didn't know the person because it was a community member. And it's a
Mm,
really important way of being part of community too.
yeah.
So thank you for
Thank you.
raising that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And you can also, if there were other eulogies that were shared at a funeral, if it was, somewhere else or even locally and people, couldn't come, you know, usually people write down the eulogies and one or more can be shared. Um, Anything that was moving can be brought into the Shiva.
I wanted to say, in addition to reading a eulogy at the funeral, I mean, one of the beautiful things I think about Shiva is that it's often very close to the death, and it's an opportunity for the person to share their experience of the death event, as we call it in grief counseling, which can be arranged from incredibly traumatic to some kind of like thing that they're just processing, the hospital, the rehab, I was like, and that, or it can be the most mystical experience they've ever had. And they are like Moses coming down from Har Sinai, having experienced this thing. And here is the community to be with them and for them to be able to say what they saw when they were there on the mountaintop. And so I think the immediacy of the Shiva presenting the opportunity to share the death event and the person's experience of it is very profound. And I mean, I don't think that needs to necessarily be invited, but I mean, I've seen it as from my own experience when my parents died of Shiva and other people who there can be a real just imperative to say what you experience there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And so often, that these experiences are atomized, or siloed. We have the death and then we have the funeral and the Shiva can allow, as you just said, a reflection of sort of tying things together and helping people to hold the reality of the loss in a more grounded way.